Thank you for coming and joining us in our last speaker of the week during our series this month. We're so happy to have Professor Fairley of University of Chicago with us. She has a prolific career, and so I want to try to get as much as her journey and her areas of expertise out and open for all of us to kind of interact with and engage with. So why don't we start with your background and your journey to becoming an attorney?
Sure. Well, it was long. It was a long journey. So I was raised in Silver Spring, Maryland, outside of Washington, D.C., by two pretty amazing public servants, both in education. I come from a long line of educators. My father was in the federal government. He worked for what's now the Department of Education. Back then it was the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. And he worked on all sorts of really big initiatives that happened in the 60s and 70s, like Head Start and such. And then he was part of the teams that would go into the South after Brown to force desegregation. He was part of those teams. My mom was at the local level. She started out as a first grade teacher, so my penmanship is almost perfect. And then she was an elementary principal. And so where I grew up, she's basically a rock star. Either she taught them or they were a parent in one of her schools. Like, she knows everybody. And so I was raised with the idea that, your job as one of their children was to go out and get the best education you can and then use that education to make the world a better place. As a child, as a girl, high schooler, I was really good in math and science. And so one of my professors, who I credit very much with helping me develop my analytical skills, said, why don't you consider engineering? And so I went to a pre-college program for engineering and became very interested in that and decided to focus on that for my college degree. I was also really on the creative side too. I loved the creative arts. And so I went to Princeton because it had an excellent engineering school, but it wasn't just an engineering school. It also had a really strong liberal arts, focus. And so I went there and got my degree in mechanical and aerospace engineering. And during the process of that, I really loved engineering school, but sort of realized that I wanted to do something that was a little bit more broad and more people-oriented. So I went directly from college, which at the time was pretty unusual, to get my MBA. I went to Wharton, got my MBA, and then I had a business career. I was in advertising and marketing, and I worked on all sorts of really fun advertising campaigns, Cool Whip, where you're like tasting recipes all the time, glamorous stuff like cosmetics and fragrances. And it was really interesting. But after a while, the last job I had in marketing, I was running a marketing department at a big pharmaceutical company. And there was a lot of really good and important work that was being done. But at the same time, I really just felt that if I was going to work this hard, I really wanted it to be about something that was more personally meaningful to me. And so it was right after 9/11 and some of the big corporate implosions like WorldCom and Enron. And I said, I'm going to do something different now. And so that's when I decided to go to law school. And I applied, and I didn't really realize how much I wanted to go until the phone rang and University of Chicago said, oh, you're in. And that's when I really knew in my heart of hearts, this is really what I wanted to do. And so I went to law school thinking that I might teach some business ethics, business law, somewhere between the intersection between business and law, but not knowing exactly what I would do. And I got to law school and I became a complete criminal law and criminal procedure geek. Loved it, ate it up. And during my 1L summer, I was an extern for Judge Rebecca Pallmeyer, who is now the chief judge here at the Northern District of Illinois.
Was here yesterday.
Yes. So, she's amazing. Love her, want to be her. And during the course of that externship, I saw what was, for me, my first ever criminal trial. And I saw what the AUSAs were doing, and I said, I don't know if I could do that, but I think I'd like to learn more about it. And so during my 2L year, I interned at the U.S. Attorney's Office here in Chicago, and then, of course, that became the only job I really wanted. And so that's kind of what set me towards the path of becoming a prosecutor.
Can you tell us about your entry into the AUSA's office?
Yeah. So I'd interned at the office, so I'd gotten to meet a number of the attorneys that worked there, and I think that helped, so that when I went to apply to come there full time, I sort of had that knowledge base there. they don't hire people right out of law school. So there are a number of different paths if that's something that you're interested in. They do accept people right out of clerkships. They accept people who've worked for 4 or 5 years in private practice. They accept people who've come up through a state's attorney's kind of system, being prosecutors, but at the state level. So there are a variety of different career paths to get into the U.S. Attorney's Office. Obviously, it's highly competitive. And so if you're interested in that, really the key themes are whatever you're doing, make sure that you have something on your resume that shows that you're demonstrating a commitment to public service, because they are always going to be looking for that. And then, of course, get as much litigation experience as you can, even if it's just motion practice, even if there are no trials going on where you are, but there's, a chance for you to stand up in court, try to get as much of that as you can. That's really what they're looking for.
So what did you do first before you were at the AUSAs?
Yeah, so my first job out of law school was to serve as an assistant attorney general for Attorney General Lisa Madigan, and I worked in criminal appeals, which I think is a great way to start as a beginning lawyer, because then you're looking at the cold hard record that somebody else made, and you see, what went wrong, what went right, and so it helps you formulate in your own mind like how you're going to do things yourself. So it's a great learning opportunity. So I did that before I joined the federal system and became an AUSA.
So you went from appeals to litigation to
Yes.
trial court.
So I went from appeals to trial court. Yeah.
Interesting. Okay. Did you end up doing appeals as well at the AUSA's office
I
eventually?
did. So at the U.S. Attorney's Office here, they really take sort of a completely vertical view of your case.
Sure.
So when you work on a case, you start from the very, very beginning when it's just an investigation. It's kind of a germ of a case, and you work with the federal agents to build the case, and then you charge the case, you try the case, and then unless there's some reason why you can't, then you also do the appeal of the case. So you sort of handle everything all the way through. If there's a habeas corpus petition, then you'd handle that as well.
So I know eventually, most recently, you were involved in a lot of the police accountability
Sure.
work here in Chicago, and working even on matters like the Laquan Donald case, and advising about what those accountability boards would look like. Can you talk about your experience and your time in those areas?
Yeah, absolutely. So here's what happened there. This is one of those things where it's just like careers are fortuitous, right? So at this point, I had spent 8 years as a federal prosecutor, and one of my former colleagues, who is the Inspector General for the City of Chicago, Joe Ferguson, was reorganizing his organization and asked me to come serve as his first deputy. So I had joined the City of Chicago Inspector General's office as first deputy and general counsel. So I had responsibility for all the legal matters for that office, and then, of course, overseeing the investigative process that's undertaken there. And I had been there for 7-8 months, and I really was enjoying it. But on a Friday afternoon, I get a call, and the assistant comes in and says, the mayor's office is on the line. And I said, well, Joe's out of the office. Do you want me to call him? And they're like, no, they want to talk to you. And I'm like, oh, am I in trouble? So they asked if I would come consider taking over the position as the chief administrator of, what was it then at the time, the Independent Police Review Authority. And so my initial reaction was, to myself anyway, it was like not just no, it was oh hell no. And it was because I knew it was really in a bad shape.
Yes.
I knew it was what was going on was really troubled. It was a turnaround situation. It was like a highly hot seat to step into, and I just I was very hesitant. And so my fiance, who's like my personal Yoda, said to me, he said, well, okay, just think about it. Okay, stop acting out of fear of failure, and say to yourself, ask yourself, is this a job that you think you can do well? Yeah, I think I could do it. Is this a job that you could feel passionate about doing? And I said, yeah, this is a really important mission. He's like, well, there's your answer, right? And so I said yes, and it was quite an experience. It was quite an eye-opening experience, but really, serving in that capacity and having a front row seat to the beginning, what was really the beginning of the reform process for the Chicago Police Department, was quite an honor and quite a privilege. And there was just a lot to be done. And so what was unique about it, for me anyway, was it was like everything that I had done prior to this professionally prepared me for that role. So for example, when I was in the corporate role, I actually built a marketing department from scratch, like just figured out, okay, what skills and capabilities do we need? How many people over here do we need doing this? You know, what is the structure? I had already done that. And so when it came to redesigning IPRA and creating COPA, I had already had the experience of building an organization from the ground up. And so it was like the planets came aligned to sort of put me into that seat at that moment. That's kind of the way I look at it. Yeah.
Yeah. So the Civilian Office of Police Accountability, now you're the chief administrator of that office. And I could understand some of the fears that you had, and I love how you overcame it. You actually looked at the work and you saw the value that you were able to do. But could you tell us, that's such an intersection of the community,
Yes.
of police, of the court system, of politics. You have a lot of intersections there. Could you tell us some of the biggest challenges that you faced there, even though I'm sure we could imagine some, but what were your biggest challenges there? And then what do you think were some of your successes as well?
Right. So I think the biggest challenge was that the agency that I was tasked to lead was by and large viewed as completely dysfunctional and completely untrustworthy. There was this history that had gone on for years where the agency, you know, the investigations ran on for years. They weren't closed in a timely manner. The, you know, oversight was considered sort of, looked like a toothless watchdog. They rarely held officers accountable. There was this data point where there were 300 officer-involved shooting incidents that had occurred during the lifetime of the agency, and they had found only 2 in which the police officers had done something wrong. And that math just didn't seem to make sense. So people really had no trust in the agency and the work that it did. And so in reforming the agency and then of course building COPA, the goal was to try to rebuild that trust. And the most important way I felt of doing that was being transparent, right? So for example, before I got there, you know, the reports were never released publicly. You know, they were sort of, everything was sort of held close to the vest. And so my view was that the only way to regain that trust and to show people that the agency was capable of doing quality work was to actually show them the work, which is put everything out. Make the reports public. So you can read the report about this shooting yourself. If you think the logic about how they got to this finding was incorrect, then you can see and call that out. And so transparency was a big part of the reforms that I put in place, in addition to trying to improve the professionalism of the way that things were being done. You know, obviously, I put in place a lot of reforms about how the investigative process was going to be managed and how the decisions were going to be made about, you know, once you got to the end of investigations. And one of the big things was to bring in more lawyers, because the sort of legal landscape of police misconduct investigations is really complicated because it throws everything together. You've got constitutional law, you've got state statutes, you've got police department rules, and the way these things intersect can be really complicated. So I really felt that they needed more lawyers to help work with the investigators throughout the investigative process to help navigate those legal waters. So that was one of the big reforms I put in place. But I think the thing that I'm most proud of that we really pushed really hard for was pushing the department to initiate changes to its use of force policy, and to do that in a public way. So for the first time ever, they went through this public comment process on their use of force policies, and that's because basically I stood on my head and I said, you have to do that. So that's probably the thing that I'm most proud about.
Wow. And the push for transparency, I think, is crucial to building trust.
Yes.
In places where you couldn't be transparent, what could you say in places, because certain things I'm sure are confidential and couldn't be released.
Right.
How did you communicate that, hey, even though we can't show this to you or can't show you this work, we still want to partner with you and we still see this work as valuable and accountability as valuable?
Yeah, so there's always going to be challenges with regard to that, because there is certainly, while an investigation is ongoing, there's not a whole lot you can say about it. And of course, you have people who are victims of police misconduct either themselves or their loved ones, who want to know what's going on. And so that was just always a constant battle. And so what I always try to say is, look, I'm going to be as transparent with you as I legally can, right? And that was always the way, under my leadership, the agency operated. Unless there was a very, very specific reason that something had to be held back, we were pushing out all the information as possible. So one of the things for example, one issue that came up was, I remember, if anybody remembers the LaGreer Jones officer-involved shooting incident, there was an incident in which a young gentleman was shot by the police, and they accidentally also shot and killed his neighbor. And so there were, the young man had made 3 911 calls to the police before this incident occurred, which really showed that he was in mental health crisis. And so I felt really strongly that those calls needed to be released immediately. And so that was something that I pushed for, even though the city was not happy about that, right? So it's really trying to make the tough calls and be transparent, even when you know it's going to be unpleasant, right?
Yeah. Well, that's a fascinating space to hold, and making the decisions as to how you serve as many constituents as possible, from the community to the victims to holding your own mandate as a city officer, et cetera. I do want to transition to your work in the classroom.
Sure, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how you started in academia?
Sure. So I started teaching, as an adjunct. My first teaching job, actually, I taught criminal procedure for DePaul one semester. They had a professor who usually taught Crim Pro that was going on medical leave, and they needed someone to fill in. And quickly, and so the dean at the time was a former colleague of mine, someone, we didn't work together, but we were across each other. She was a defense attorney when I was a prosecutor, and she said, Sharon, can you help us out? And so that was my first experience, and I loved it. It was great. I love being in a classroom with law students. It's just really fun. And of course, I went to University of Chicago, and so they had an opportunity to come teach legal ethics. One of my former colleagues was teaching at the time, and he said he needed some help. And so that's when I started. I started as an adjunct. And then 2018, I was trying to figure out what I wanted to do next career-wise, and it really just felt like the right time for me to kind of just settle in. And so I was able to have a conversation with the dean there, and he said, well, just come on and work with us. And so that's where I am, and it's been a fantastic experience. So I'm teaching. The first quarter I taught public corruption, which was really interesting, because pretty much any day, all I'd have to do is walk in a classroom with a newspaper and say, here in Illinois is what we're talking about. Then in the spring, I taught the legal ethics course that I've been teaching for 5 years, and in the fall, I taught a seminar called The Law, Politics, and Policy of Policing. And now this quarter, I'm teaching Criminal Procedure 1, so it's the 4th and 5th Amendment version of Crim Pro, so that's been a lot of fun too. Yeah.
So we always like to talk about here at UIC John Marshall about what qualities help make a strong law student. And you've been a law student, you also teach. What qualities do you think lend itself to law students performing well in the classroom?
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously the first thing is just to prepare, right? Sure. I mean, it's going to be hard to really digest the material if you haven't done the preparation, so that you can go into the classroom experience and get the most out of it. So preparation is key, but then also just engaging in the dialogue. What makes it most fun for me is when you have a class, it's really engaging with the material and really wanting to understand it and talk about it, and talk about where we think the law is wrong, where we think the law is doing the right thing, how we might change the law if we think that it's wrong. And so those conversations, I think, are really helpful. And, I teach kind of the way I wish I had been taught in law school, right? So, to me, it's fun from that perspective to be able to sort of take the subject matter and say, well, here's how I think about it, and here's how I think it's easy for other people to understand it. I'm very much a visual learner, so if you're like, when I'm in the classroom, I'm like constantly like drawing graphs and diagrams and showing how different factors influence each other, that kind of thing. And because that's how I process things. And so I figure if I benefit from that. Maybe others will too, so.
I'm going to ask one or two more questions, but I also want to open it up to the audience to ask Professor Fairley questions as well. So think about any questions that you might have. So when it comes to, I just drew a blank. Yes, here we go. So oftentimes I found one of my challenges as a law student was when you're reading these cases, you're talking about engagement, student engaging the material. You almost look at it as a third party and not as how would I put on this case, or what defense or argument would I have. And how important is that kind of mindset about knowing that you can hold the law and that you can shift the law yourself to the learning environment in the classroom?
Yeah, well, I think, when we talk, everybody says that, law school is about teaching you how to think, right? And so I think that's an important part of the process, is really understanding what the different arguments are, how they affect each other, and being able to articulate, right?
Yeah.
So when I was teaching policing last fall, there were a lot of students in the classroom that were very much kind of on the more progressive side of the thought process. And so I was constantly asking them, well, can you think about what the point of view is on the other side? Can you think about what the rationale is on the other side? Because it's really important, because in order to be a good advocate for your own side, you have to really be able to understand what the other side is saying, and then be able to explain why you think your point of view is better. And it's almost every form of law that you're going to be practicing, whether it's transactional law or litigation, that's what it's about, right?
Yeah.
It's about, here's my position, here's why I think my position is the right position. I understand your position is this. Here's what piece you're missing, or here's how I weigh this piece a little bit heavier, and that's why I come out differently. Right. So it's being able to articulate those kinds of thoughts.
Also, the path to teaching, honestly, when I started law school, I didn't think about academia. It kind of just happened along the course of my career. But I think it's powerful for students to think about entering academia even while they're still in school.
Sure.
So there's more than one path. There's more like the scholarly path where you publish, but there's also maybe the path that you took, which is more professor from practice.
Yes.
I've developed some expertise, and now I can teach on my expertise. Can you talk about the different paths of the classroom?
Yes, absolutely. So there's lots of different ways to be, in the law school environment. And you don't have to be you don't have to necessarily go on the tenured track. There are, experiential learning positions. There are clinical positions. And my position is called Professor from Practice. There are only 2 of us at the law school, but it's out of recognition that, I have had a career, I have some expertise in the field, that I've been practicing in, and that's what I'm going to be sharing with my students. And so it gives me the opportunity to focus my academic research and writing on the area that I feel passionate about, which has been great. So I've been doing most of my work and writing on police accountability, because based on my experiences, there was a lot I had to get off my chest. So I'm writing all about that now. And just to have the opportunity to do that is just fantastic. So if you have like an area that you're passionate about, my guess is if you want to spend some time really focusing on developing that area of law, then being in academia is a great way to do that. And I really appreciate the platform that I have now to be able to focus on the police accountability issues that I think are important, for not just in Chicago but nationwide, because it's an issue, not just here but everywhere. Every large urban jurisdiction has challenges. So,
any questions? 1 and then 2.
Yeah. So with COPA, so I've been influenced since I actually spent a year in Silver Spring after I graduated.
Oh, great.
Don't have an affiliation with Chicago.
Okay.
But I heard Flynn Taylor speak shortly after I started school here, and was inspired by his work all the way from Fred Taylor through the Burge
Sure.
torture victims.
Yeah.
And one of the challenges that he faced as a defense attorney was being able to procure information from the police department. It was like extremely clamped down. And as far as like the Burge situation, you had next state attorney Daley
Yes.
How do you actually go about like procuring that information? I know COPA is affiliated with the city, so
Sure.
I imagine there's
Yeah.
some additional ability as opposed to a defense attorney, but how do you actually go about procuring that information?
Right. So there are a number of tools that can be used, right? So first of all, when COPA was created by ordinance, there's certain things that they have to be more transparent about. So one of the things was the video release policy. So that's indoctrinated now as policy to release certain reports and videos about the most serious police incidents within 60 days, right? Then, of course, we had a lot of litigation that ended up in a good way, sponsored by the Invisible Institute. So now police disciplinary records are pretty much available through that process. But for other things, there's the FOIA process. So for example, this spring I'm teaching a seminar called Government Integrity and Transparency. And so one of the issues we're going to be tackling is how do you force a government entity to be transparent when they're not? Like what are the tools that you can use legally to do that? And so FOIA is obviously one of the most important tools. Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Sure.
Back, in the back.
Is there anything being done to retroactively repair some of the damages by corruption? The first is OPS and IFRA, not COPA. And I mean, no matter how many times you change the name of damages done in the past, people will be serious. Is there anything that's going to be done retroactively to reopen some cases and people that were dismissed?
Yeah. So one of the things that I've been working on most recently is I really felt like in order to understand the police accountability structure that we have here in Chicago right now, it's important to do two things. One, go back historically and to try to figure out how it came to be what it is, right? And then the other thing is to look at what it is relative to what's going on elsewhere in the country. So last year I focused on that piece of it, and so I looked at what was going on elsewhere, and and I'll talk about that in a minute. But then I'm looking at the history of it, and it's been fascinating. And I will tell you that the problems that we're having now have been around for decades, probably even a century. So I've gone all the way back to when the department was in its earliest stages in the 1890s and the early 1900s, and there were issues with corruption and lack of accountability going all the way back that far. So the problem we have here in Chicago is what we've gone through, we have this thing, I call it the scandal, reform, repeat. Scandal, reform, repeat. So there's a scandal, we institute a bunch of reforms, and then we're like, oh, okay, done. We sit back, then there's another scandal, and then we go through the same thing all over again. So we haven't been able to create a truly sustainably effective accountability system. And so that's what really is necessary right now. And I think that there's a number of things that are outlined in the consent decree that will help point us in that direction. But I think there's still a lot of work to be done because there's still a lot of structural impediments that prevent the system that we have from being truly effective. So in terms of going back and sort of repairing things, when I was the chief, we definitely did open cases. When there were cases that, particularly if someone came to me, a mother of someone who had been killed, and she said, could you just look at this case? We would re-look at those cases and many times reopen those cases. And you're seeing the product of a lot of that work coming out right now. Just a couple weeks ago, COPA ruled on a case that they had reopened and said, yeah, no, this was not investigated properly at first, and yeah, this was wrong. So we see some of that, the benefit of that work coming through right now. Then looking at what's going on throughout the rest of the country. So I did a survey of the police oversight in the top 100 U.S. cities and just kind of looked and compared and contrasted the systems. Wow. And there's basically what you see is there's a trend towards creating civilian oversight, right? For sure, civilian oversight, it's been around for 60 years now. And so even though there's a lot of elements that push against it, it's basically become a normative element within police accountability when you look at the large U.S. jurisdictions. But now the emphasis is on what I just said, the challenge of creating a sustainably effective system. So you see a lot of cities that are really innovating by creating multi-tiered, multifunctional systems. So Seattle, for example, just created this really robust system where they have a police commission, they have an investigative agency, they have an inspector general, and the three of those entities working together provide, the effective oversight. So it'll be interesting to see, how well they succeed after they've been, have that system in place for a while.
I saw another hand, but just from your response just now, I'm fascinated by structural inequality. We're actually doing structural inequality in the law here for diversity. We've been talking about structural inequality in voting, housing, education, et cetera. So I'm really excited to see how our panels go. They're being led by our student organizations. But one of the things that you talked about is that some of the structural inequalities that you saw are historical, going back 100 years. And if you don't mind, I'm so ready for the book when you're ready to publish that book. But what are some of the historical structural inequalities that you're seeing, if you wouldn't mind sharing?
No, absolutely. So when you look back to the way the police department was first formed, right, in its early stage, it was basically a mechanism for the local politicians to get their work done, right? I mean, literally, there was a direct connection. The police officers would go into their beats and they would fundraise, and they would do political activities. So there's always been this really unhealthy connection between the police department and local politics. So it kind of starts there. And then there's just been this lack of accountability. I mean, and you'll look, I've been looking at these reports that are from like 1904 and 1911, and you have these reports, people sort of going in and looking at the department going, there is no discipline here, like who's minding this door? It goes back that far. There just was nobody embraced the idea of discipline and accountability, and that as a core value has been missing, since all the way back there. And then so what happens is you see that playing out just over time. And so with every agency that we have here in Chicago was formed because there was some crisis, right? So in 1960, there was a Summerdale scandal where there were 8 officers who were found to, basically being engaging and helping this guy who was a burglar. They served as his lookout and sometimes served as the getaway car. And so the police board, the Chicago Police Board, which still exists today, was part of what came out of that scandal crisis.
Scandal reform.
Right. So then we had, in the 60s, there was just a series of scandals, including the police department's handling of the race riots. But the biggest one is anybody familiar with the Fred Hampton killing? Okay, right. So in 1969, 14 police officers went to execute a search warrant at an apartment where there were a number of Black Panthers who were residing, and the whole thing erupted in gunfire, and the police said, look, they shot first, and that was completely untrue, right? And so that and a number of scandals led to the creation of the Office of Professional Services, which was a group of civilians that were put, but still inside the police department, that were then tasked with overseeing police misconduct investigations. And the city agreed to this very reluctantly. So there are a number of law organizations, the Chicago Bar Association, a number of legal organizations that had been pushing the city to do civilian oversight, and the city had been pushing back. So finally they had to give in, so they created OPS, but OPS was within the department, reported up to the superintendent, so it wasn't independent, right? So then flash forward to 2008, there's another crisis. An officer is caught on video beating a female bartender. And so that was the crisis that created IPRA, right? And then, of course, we flash forward even further to Laquan McDonald, and which leads to the reforms that create COPA. So it's just, the culture is just so ingrained, and that's what really needs to change.
Wow. I believe we had a question here.
So when I think of COPA, I think of people who run it would be defense attorneys. So it's different to hear that a prosecutor kind of ran it. So do you find any personal challenges going from a prosecutor to running COPA?
So if we could just repeat the question.
Sure. So the question is, COPA, you would think it would be run by people who are defense attorneys. How did I feel about being a prosecutor put in that role? So, I saw my job as a prosecutor to be all about justice, right? And so doing the right thing. And so in COPA, for me, it was just more of the same. So I was responsible for overseeing these investigations and then, deciding whether or not there was enough evidence to show that the officer did something wrong. And so I tried to call those balls and strikes as I saw them. If there was evidence, yes. If there wasn't, no. And so to the whole point about, misconduct investigation is, it is absolutely essential that they be considered neutral and fair for both sides, right? And so the challenge with that really is, you're always making somebody mad, right?
Yeah.
You come out and you say the officer did something wrong, he's mad. You come out and you say that the officer, what he did was fine, then the complainant is not happy. So it's just the nature of the beast. You're always going to be in that situation where, people are going to be throwing shots at you. You just have to kind of suck it up and say, here's my report, here's the analysis, here's the evidence that was found, here's how I applied the facts to the law. If you don't agree, then let's have that conversation. So.
Keelan, and then in the back.
Hi.
Hi.
Speaking of nature of the beast, my question was much worse if you're being a professor, despite that you're a prosecutor, when dealing with business conduct. So I can imagine that, especially in Chicago, you might have multiple students who had biases. I guess all of us had some biases or bias on the subject, but I guess there might be students who had extreme biases on one side or the other. So whether it was not applicable, if it's not applicable, never mind. But if you did you counter that those extreme biases in the classroom? And if you had, how did you go about it?
Yeah, so when you're talking about these kinds of issues, it's hard not to have a conversation that involves people's personal opinions about these things, right? And so my goal is to present, here's the law of it, here's the policy, here's how we got to where we are, and then have a dialogue about it. But making sure that both sides are represented. So, for example, when I was over COPA, I didn't see that my responsibility was only to the victim, right? My responsibility was also to make sure the officer got a fair shake and was treated fairly as well. They're doing a really important job, so you have to be able to balance those. So as a professor, I'm always going to try to make sure that both sides of the argument are represented so that we understand them and then can articulate them. You may, at the end of the day, come out on one side, and that's perfectly fine. But the issue is to be respectful and to understand, make sure that you at least engage in some dialogue to be able to understand where the other person is coming from.
Yes, please.
I was gonna say it's very frustrating to understand the process. You just saw the mayor fire Superintendent Johnson for supposedly lying. They pulled his street, lying face back to the state, back to the county. Now, John Van Dyke was convicted. There were other officers there that did lie in the reports and everything. There was a young lady with Peter Boyd that got shot in the head by an officer who shot into a crowd. There's an SOP that says you never shoot into a crowd.
Right.
Punished for that.
Yes.
And a lot of police officers do lie, and they're never punished. And yet, some civilians lie too, and they kind of say Justice Smollett is going to be, indicted and charged or whatever. But it's frustrating and hard to understand how a process is going to be done and going to work. And there's so many contradictions that are current and maybe back, like what you said. So
Yes, it is frustrating, and it continues to be frustrating. Like I said, there's still a lot of challenges. On this particular issue, one of the things that I think that, when I look at the culture of the Chicago Police Department, the problem is that they just have not had a culture that really embraces and values accountability. And it's going to take, because it's been decades, right? It's going to take a while before that culture changes to accept those values. So what do we do until that cultural shift happens? Then you've got to have disciplinary measures that are enforced, because that's the only way you're going to change the behavior. You can't wait for the attitudes to change. You've got to correct the behavior by consistent disciplinary action. And this is an area where I don't think the department has been as consistent as it could be at reinforcing this idea that if you lie, we're going to fire you, right? And I have been very vocal about that. So when the Chicago Police Board put out their rules for comment last year, one of the recommendations that I made, among several, was that they specifically put in their code of conduct, there's nothing in there about that right now, that if you lie, we're going to fire you. Because bringing it to that high level of, that says this is a value that we hold very dear, and that's the only way to convey that. And then, of course, to be consistent about it. So I definitely understand your frustration. I mean, so there was, the case that the police board decided just a few weeks ago. There was a case where an officer off duty encounters a young man who happened to be a special needs person, young man, and he ends up shooting the kid. Thankfully, he didn't die. I mean, he wasn't killed. But at the end of the day, there was an investigation that was done. The officer sort of had all these explanations for why he did what he did, and COPA really came out and said, look, they basically sort of said none of that was true. Like, they had facts to show that what the officer was not true. Yet COPA did not recommend that he be fired, right? They only recommended a suspension, and then the police superintendent entered into kind of a plea agreement also that the officer not be fired. The officer actually admitted that he fired his gun without without the legal justification. But instead of being fired, he's now going to get a suspension. And then the police board signed off on that without holding any hearing about whether or not that was the right sanction based on what had happened. And so that's when I say that there's still structural impediments to effective oversight. That to me is like a good case that's an example that shows the structural problems that still exist here. Is that there should be, there shouldn't be, if a police officer uses excessive force, uses deadly force in a way that's inappropriate, to me that means that officer is unfit to serve in that role and should be fired. Unless there's some really crazy extenuating circumstance. Me being a lawyer, I'm always going to have a little bit of an out. There's, not, some things aren't always black and white, but there just shouldn't be that happening, right? So.
I have a follow-up to that.
Yes.
Changing culture is never easy. And a lot of cultures are because of historical frameworks that just are very slow to be changed. And two things that you mentioned that I think are really critical is, one, the makeup of the organization, meaning who you hire and how you hire.
Yes.
Because you're always going to have people that have been with the organization for a long time and are used to the culture a certain way, but you can always start with new people and train them differently. So I think who you hire and how you train are really important factors. And you mentioned some of the comments that you made and some of the recommendations that you made. Did they have to do with hiring and training? And then also, when it comes to hiring and training, that can only be implemented by whoever's in leadership.
Right. Yes.
That own or value certain qualities in who they hire and value certain training. So I don't know if you could just talk about those dichotomies.
Yeah, so in my most recent research, I've been looking at these really interesting historical documents. So I ran across this document a couple weeks ago, and it said basically, I think it was either 1925 or by 1925 or 1930, the city of Chicago was 20% Irish, but the police department was 50% Irish. And I'm like, wow, that explains a lot, right? So the issue of hiring and promotion and training, these are all issues that received extensive coverage in the consent decree, right? And there are a number of reforms that are being, implemented to address these issues. So historically, the department has been really unsuccessful at creating a diverse police force. And there are a number of reasons for that, but one of them I've been told, and so I'm just going to sort of tell you what I've heard. I can't say I've seen proof of this. This is sort of more anecdotal. Is that part of the recruiting process is that there's actually a mental health examination. And that what my understanding is, a lot of the people of color get weeded out on the basis of that. And so I don't know why that is or if that's actually true, but this is something that I have heard. And so these are the kinds of structural things that I think are now trying to be addressed through the provisions and the reforms that are put in place by the consent decree. So the other thing is, being more proactive at attracting a more diverse group of individuals into the job. It's a tough time to recruit police officers, right? I mean, and so what I found, because I used to be able to, in my old job, I had the opportunity to speak to all the new recruit classes right before they graduated. And my experience was they were really the right ones. They were the ones who were, stepping up to the plate and raising their hands to be police officers. They were really there because they wanted to serve. Because obviously in this environment, right? So it made me very optimistic that, you know, at least they're starting out with the right attitude. Now, we're not sure what's going to happen once, you know, one of the wizened 25-year detectives takes them under the wing and says, let me show you how it really works.
Yeah.
We don't know what's going to happen when, you know, after they get out there, but at least they're starting out with their minds in the right place, which is a good thing. And then hopefully some of these reforms through more effective supervision, because that really was one of the biggest problems of this department, right? There was a huge span of control issue, meaning that we're too many officers being supervised by too few supervisors. And so the supervisor's job had basically become paper pushing. They weren't really out in the field watching and, you know, overseeing what was being done. And so that's also part of some of the reforms that are being put in place right now with the consent decree.
Sure. Any more questions here in the front and then again in the back? Fine.
I'm not totally sure about the timing of all this, so maybe this is outside of your time at COPA, but a couple of years ago, the special prosecutor statute was amended slightly, and I've seen that there are some cases where victims or family members of victims of police-related shootings have tried to use that as a mechanism to get a case against the police going where the state's attorney has decided not to file any charges. Have you seen that happening, or whether there's any chance of that really being a viable way to get criminal charges brought when the state's attorney's already said not interested?
It's an uphill battle, I will tell you. And I know that there was one shooting, it was probably the first shooting that our agency called outside of policy once our leadership team took over. As a individual named, the gentleman's name was Farmer, and his father was really, really seeking justice for him. And so I know that after we made our findings, he went to try to go back to the state's attorney's office to have her relook at the case. And I think he also tried to go down this path to get a special prosecutor. I don't think it went well for him. I think it's a really uphill battle. So the issue so when you think about police misconduct, right, so there are three legal mechanisms to hold a police officer accountable, right? There's the criminal justice system, there's the civil litigation where you can sue for damages, and then there's the administrative sort of disciplinary process. By and large, it's really only the disciplinary process where you have any hope, right? Because these other two they're certainly not a deterrent, and they're not usually a very effective option. So starting with the criminal justice system, right? We know that state's attorneys even seeking to charge someone is an uphill battle, right? Mm-hmm. There are very few officers that are actually charged, and we all know kind of why that is, right? Because they work with the police departments all the time. Then even if they are charged, right, you've got this really big beyond a reasonable doubt hurdle. And the legal structure that underpins a lot of this stuff is really hard, right? So when you look at the law, the constitutional boundary for use of force, it's actually pretty low, right? There's, right now, the Supreme Court thinks it's perfectly fine for an officer to use deadly force against an individual who is no threat to them, merely because the officer has probable cause to believe that they have committed a violent felony. So if you have someone who's just committed a bank robbery and they're running away, that person can literally be running away and the officer is still justified in shooting them, right? So the law is very low, and then of course you have the beyond a reasonable standard, which is very high. So the criminal route is just not going to yield a lot of redress. You know, we did get the conviction for LaQuan McDonald. That's great. It's a rarity, right? In the civil side, again, you have the same legal problem, but there's an extra barrier. There's something called qualified immunity, right? Mm-hmm. So it's even harder in the civil route to get a remedy against an officer who's done something wrong. So it's really this disciplinary area that's why these accountability systems are so important, and why jurisdictions are really working hard to get that right.
We are almost coming to our close. I think this is going to be our last question, and then hopefully I have one more.
Mm-hmm.
Which I feel like replaced that.
Yeah.
Because we all know, I think it was an officer that was just caught sucking a turtle's wings.
Yeah, so this has been pretty well recognized as another big challenge, certainly here in Chicago. And so you'll see, again, also provisions in the consent decree that are meant to address mental and wellness issues for officers. The challenge is, okay, imagine you're a police officer. Do you feel comfortable going to tell your boss that you are having some issues? No, because you know what's going to happen? They're going to take your police powers away, right? And so there's this constant tension between that. And so they've got to figure out how to manage that. And it is a really stressful, it can be a very stressful existence depending on what your assignment is. So this is definitely a challenge, but I would look to the consent decree to see the provisions that they have in there to deal with that. I'm not saying it's the complete panacea, but at least it's been recognized an issue and we're working towards some solutions for it.
So in a lot of areas of your career, from federal prosecutor to the Inspector General's office to CUPA, were there opportunities for law students to work with some of these organizations?
Oh yeah, I mean
Well, we know the federal prosecutors.
Sure, so all of those organizations do internships.
Awesome.
Yeah, and so if you're interested and you're passionate and you want to learn or get a feel for what these agencies do, I strongly encourage you to take them up.
And so for the Inspector General's office, what and if we could speak about that in CUPA,
Sure.
what qualities do you think they're looking for and experience that they value?
Yeah, I mean, so they're going to be looking for, students who have, demonstrated an interest in public service and, who are in good standing at the law school.
Is writing important?
Writing is definitely important. Writing's going to always be important.
And their writing sample being
Yes.
on point.
There's going to be always a writing sample that's asked for.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and we thank Professor Fairley for being
Sure.
with us as well.